Welcome to the Intuitive Insight Podcast. This is Timmy E., your host, your counselor, and your Sherpa for our episodic journey through mental health, counseling, and other areas of wellness and balance. During this episode, we are discussing a mental health issue that affects every person on the planet, and that is anxiety. We'll go through all the different aspects of anxiety, the good anxiety, the not so good anxiety, and discuss different ways to help deal. We shall also introduce our new feature called the Intuitive Insight Mailbag, where we answer some questions and discuss experiences from you. It's going to be a good episode, so make sure to keep it streaming on the Intuitive Insight Podcast. First off, I'd like to welcome everybody again back to the Intuitive Insight Podcast. This is episode 3, and we will be talking about the different types of anxiety. Now, I think this is something that a lot of people experience. Every person, what I mentioned in the introduction of the show, is that every single person on the planet experiences anxiety. And part of the reason for that is because anxiety is part of every species. Every animal, every person understands and experiences anxiety. Every, from a caterpillar to a grizzly bear, they all understand anxiety, and it's part of our biological and biological makeup as well, or physiology as well. Main reason why it's much more pronounced in the mental aspect, in the mental health aspect, for us, for humans, is because of the fact that we are now the dominant species in the world. We are now the species that pretty much controls the world. And anxiety, from a very, very primitive, primal instinct, is something that derives from feeling stressed or feeling duress. So think of it like this. If you have an animal, you have a creature trapped between, you have them cornered. What do? They're going to either fight. Even the nicest, fluffiest looking bunny, squirrel, whatever, is going to fight you. Is going to try to bite you. Is going to try and do so, and then try to get away. So there's that fight or flight response that is part of every creature, including us as people. And what happens is now, maybe many years ago, when humans were not necessarily fully the dominant species, when they were just as easily could have been prey rather than predator, there were times in which we as humans would be worried about this as well. So it comes from that very, very primal instinct. Now, in today's world, in today's society, and even after the humans became the more dominant species, there still is this anxiety. But part of it it's shifted, it's evolved, more so from a physical one, and has become a mental. It has mental causes and emotional causes now as well. Think of it like this: if you have a dog, if you have a pet, if you scare it, it's going to become anxious, especially if it understands that, hey, every time I'm in this situation, this is going to happen to me. Something bad is going to happen to me. Same thing with us as people. But the interesting part is it's no longer about being cornered physically. Although if we are honestly cornered physically, we're still going to experience that fight or flight, that anxiety, that surge of adrenaline, all of that kind of stuff. But now, when we feel and we experience similar situations mentally, emotionally, that can cause anxiety for us as well. Now, don't get me wrong. There are definitely some good anxiety versus not so good anxiety. For example, having a little bit of anxiety isn't necessarily a bad thing. If you think about it, if you're a student, or if you're a student and you're worried about a test, you're going to try to study, because if you don't, you're not going to do well on the test. Most individuals are not going to be good on a test. However, if you have so much anxiety, it creates just a feeling of being frozen or a feeling of flight. Okay, I'm so afraid of this test that I don't want to take it, and I'm going to pretend to be sick. I'm going to pretend to be this. I'm going to pretend to be that, and that carries on to other aspects of life. So having a little bit of anxiety, just a little bit, is a signal of that this is something that we care about, something that we need to do, something that we need to do well on. Well, I know there are some individuals who are not drivers, but if you think about it, taking your driver's exam, I'm sure there was a little bit of anxiety because, number one, your motivation was a number of things likely, but from my perspective, I was just excited to be able to drive around and do things on my own, have a little bit more freedom or freedom to do things, be able to go out more, do things like that. And so the anxiety I had was kind of an anticipatory, excited type of anxiety. I knew I had to ace it. I knew I had to do well. And that was the motivation I had. So I had a lot of that good anxiety going for me. And at the same time, on the other side of the spectrum, you could have that anxiety where you're just so concerned about doing well. You're so concerned about failing. You're so concerned about bombing things that you freeze. And that becomes now the quote, bad type of anxiety. I think the question ultimately here is, how do we know the good anxiety versus the not so good anxiety? It's interesting. Whenever I've worked with individuals regarding anxiety, I've always asked them one simple question. When you're experiencing anxiety, is it making you more vigilant? Is it making you more, what kind is it? Is it the anticipatory kind, the one where, I'm so excited, I have to be ready? Or is it the frozen in fear kind? The one where is it the fight kind? Where yes, I'm going to do this, I'm going to go for it. Or is it the flight kind? Or flight or freeze, the one where I really don't want to deal with this, or freeze, where you're stuck in a moment and you can't get out of it. Cue the U2 song right now. But either way, when someone answers that question, when I work with them in counseling and otherwise, they often say, well, there are times when I do experience the freezing or escaping flight, and there are times when I experience the fight one, where I kind of get that adrenaline rush going and I want to be part of it. And right away, I with that question say, all right, what's the difference between the fight anxiety, the good anxiety, the one that where you're excited and you're anticipating it, versus the flight anxiety? And most of the time, everyone always asks me or says one simple thing. Well, honestly, it's just the fact that I really don't want to do it, or I'm really afraid that I'm going to bomb it. I'm really afraid. That's the big thing. I'm afraid. So right away, anxiety comes from fear. And once again, when you have fear, you're more likely to try. In many situations, when you're afraid, you're more likely to try to weave your way out of it or be frozen in fear. And in the cases where it's forced upon you, then of course, just like the little squirrel or just like the little bunny trapped in a corner, you're going to fight back. But the difference, once again, is what is the motivating factor? Fear often creates anxiety. And that is the, quote, negative anxiety. At the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, you have anticipation and excitement, the nervous excitement. That also provides a little bit of anxiety as well. But that's the kind of anxiety where you're excited. You want to be part of it. You want more of it. Think of it like if you are a roller coaster enthusiast, racing enthusiast, if you're actually racing and doing these kinds of things, sport enthusiast, you're excited. You're on the edge of your seat. You want to know what happens next. You want to be able to you can't wait until you go up that roller coaster. You go down the roller coaster. As you're going up, you're experiencing more and more excitement, more and more the positive anxiety, because you're preparing yourself for that long decline, that long loop down. And of course, once it's done, it goes back. It goes back to that was awesome. That was really, really great. I really want to do it again. And, it kind of goes back down. Eventually, you start going back down to your baseline levels. Difference with the other part of anxiety, the negative part of anxiety, is sometimes even after you remove yourself from the situation, it reinforces that I can't handle the situation. And perhaps it's not that we can't handle the situation, it's more so that we have to slowly and gradually overcome it. Up next, we will start to discuss some of the more negative aspects of anxiety in depth, such as different types of anxiety disorders, social phobias, generalized anxiety disorder, panic attacks, etc. Stay tuned. Promote and advertise right here on the Intuitive Insight Podcast and have your business, practice, or product be noted and highlighted on future episodes. If you would like to partner with us on the Intuitive Insight Podcast and reach a new audience, send an email to media@intuitiveinsightcounseling.com. All right, we are back here on the Intuitive Insight Podcast, and now we're going to go over some of the more negative anxiety disorders or issues in terms of mental health. I'm sure a lot of you have seen one or experienced anxiety in the past, and you've likely seen some in the media and also in your personal lives, in the lives of people you live with every day and you see every day. Anxiety, once again, a lot of it, especially the negative aspect, a lot of it is based on fear. Whether that fear is something that is real, imagined, within yourself, or internally or externally. A lot of anxiety is based on fear. So, for example, I'm sure a lot of you are aware of regular phobias: arachnophobia, fear of spiders, claustrophobia, fear of enclosed spaces, all of those kinds of all the different types of phobias out there. Now, interestingly enough, that is understandable, and that's just one specific thing. I think everybody has things that they're afraid of. I was actually afraid of heights previously. Yet, at the same time, there are ways to overcome these phobias. A lot of it is based on graduated exposure, flooding, systematic desensitization, a lot of different things to help manage that. But once again, phobias, especially if they're one phobia, it's not. I'm not going to say that it's easily treatable. It can certainly be difficult, but it is something that can be gradually addressed over time with therapy, with behavioral techniques, so on and so forth, even medication. And then eventually there are even further more negative types of anxiety that we can experience as well, such as generalized anxiety disorder. And this is one where fear and the anxiety is a long-term thing that you notice. It's been with you, that excessive worry, excessive concern, almost to a point of paranoia about the anxiety, about being worried with a lot of different aspects of your life, and it's active for 6+ months. So oftentimes that can be considered a little bit of generalized anxiety disorder. It's difficult to control the worry. It's associated with 3 or more of the following symptoms: being easily fatigued, feeling restless or feeling on edge, irritability, muscle tension, difficulty concentrating or your mind going blank, and insomnia, sleep disturbance of some kind. So a lot of generalized anxiety disorder, I kind of liken it when I work with individuals on it is, think of your anxiety turned up, not a notch, but more so it's just there for a very, very long period of time, and it's preventing you from doing the things that you're supposed to do, preventing you from going to work, preventing you from wanting to see your friends, preventing you from doing the things that you enjoy doing. If you think about it, a lot of it sounds like depression, except it's the opposite end of depression. Depression is having no energy and having absolutely no energy. And anxiety is having so much nervous, fearful energy that we just can't seem. It just bogs us down. It bogs the person down from doing things that they enjoy. Ways to deal with generalized anxiety disorder. Once again, start off with, it depends on the person. I believe, once again, in a very strength-based perspective. So if CBT works, cognitive behavioral therapy, that's great. If behavioral therapies work, if graduated exposure works, if a lot of it is about trying to stabilize the symptoms in the beginning. And of course, with any type of mental health issue, there's always a root cause. There's something that's something deep down, a deep-rooted cause that permeates into the person's everyday life. And once a person is stabilized, that's when we can start working with the individual to really address what are the root causes of the anxiety, of the generalized anxiety. You also have agoraphobia, which is a very, very severe type of social phobia. Social phobia or social anxiety is very, very different than agoraphobia. Social anxiety, it can be similar, but social anxiety tends to be a lot more, well, I'm fearful of being judged negatively. But it doesn't mean that you can't go places. It doesn't mean that you're afraid to step outside of your house. It might be specific to an environment or a situation. I'm afraid of being judged harshly when I am speaking in front of a crowd, when I'm presenting in front of my coworkers, when I am about to do a recital of some kind. That's a lot of social. I'm afraid when I'm in a bar situation, and I'm afraid of talking to members of the opposite sex or members potential romantic interests. A lot of that's social anxiety. And once again, there's a lot of techniques and a lot of ways and to deal with that. Ultimately, once again, root cause. What's the root cause of that fear? What's the fear? What's the fear? What's the cause? What's the root fear that makes you afraid to be judged negatively by someone? Different than agoraphobia. Agoraphobia is a fear of being out in public places, a fear of being around people. It's an extreme fear where you personally don't go out. You stay in your house. You stay in your, quote, safe zone. The difference and the difficulty with agoraphobia overall is that it's an extreme sense of anxiety where it prevents you from doing, once again, prevents you from doing things that you need to do at times. It can be something that is treated once again. And it can be something treated once again, but the difficult part to treat agoraphobia is that if they don't want to leave their place, it can be really difficult. And sometimes agoraphobia can lead to other situations, other mental health issues, like hoarding is an issue that's there. Very, very, very a lack of social skills. It can lead to to other aspects and other negative mental health issues as well. But ultimately, agoraphobia, once again, is treatable. And I believe that with the advent of the internet, with the advent of online counseling and everything that Intuitive Insight Counseling can provide as well as many, many other counselors, licensed clinical social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, there are ways to work with someone to overcome agoraphobia. Once again, not to be cured of it, but more so about to manage the symptoms of agoraphobia. Lastly, we are going to discuss about panic attacks and panic disorder. Panic attacks and panic disorder, it's interesting, it's a little bit different than when you experience from an anxiety attack. Think about anxiety attacks. You're experiencing, with anxiety attacks, you're experiencing a lot of fear. You're experiencing a lot of You're experiencing sometimes tremors. You're experiencing trembling or shaking. You're experiencing shortness of breath. All of that kind of stuff. You're feeling dizzy. Lots of these different things. Those are all. That's panic attack, and those are some of the same symptoms between a panic attack and an anxiety attack. The difference between the panic attack and anxiety attack is that with a panic attack or panic disorder, you start to feel physical symptoms, like almost as if there's this impending doom that something really bad is physically going to happen to you, that something really bad is about to happen, like you're having a heart attack. I've had individuals talk with me before about panic attacks, and they asked, I felt like I was having a heart attack. I felt like I was having a stroke. And of course, that really, really, really scares people because they're actually feeling a somatic response to an extreme sense of anxiety. Once again, big difference between anxiety attack, panic attack is number one, you have feelings of choking, you have feelings that of impending doom, that I'm going to die, and you have a fear of losing control, and then your body starts acting out in somatic ways, especially in similar situations like I'm having a heart attack. And once you get into a hospital, that's when they can start to differentiate between panic attack and heart attack. It's especially difficult for individuals when they are first starting out and they're first started to notice their first panic attack. But once again, ways to deal with it. Panic attacks, anxiety attacks, all comes down to a mindset. If you really think about it, what's going on with a panic attack or an anxiety attack? Fear, fight or flight response. So a lot of it, once again, is trying to understand, okay, what's causing this fear? What's causing this panic? What's causing this anxiety? If we feel that we are not physically in duress, that's a key right there. We are not in physical duress. So I'm okay. I'm not not going to be harmed physically in any way. That's great. Obviously, then it comes down to, okay, something mental or something emotional is causing a lot of this fear. But once you get to that point, it's about trying to stabilize. What are some different ways to stabilize? Number one, believe it or not, breathing techniques are a big help to this. Think about yoga breathing, in through your nose, out through your mouth. Deep breathing, such as yoga breathing, meditative breathing, are very, very helpful in these endeavors. Another type of technique that can be utilized is called grounding techniques. And this is based on being able to use your five senses to kind of get yourself into the present moment. Use your eyes, use your sight, use your hearing, use your olfactory, your nose, use your taste buds, use your tactile, your feeling, your touch, to be able to recognize that, hey, you know what? I have to get myself into the present moment, and combining a couple of those things to help stabilize is certainly a way to help manage. Of course, if you're experiencing a lot of panic attacks for extended period of time and panic attacks for extended period of time, of course, something to discuss with your medical professional as well as with a therapist, psychologist, licensed clinical social worker, counselor, psychiatrist, so on. There are also medications that can be provided, but once again, medications are not a be-all, end-all. They're not a cure-all. It depends on being able to combine medicine along with other supports as well, such as therapy and lifestyle changes, among other things. The Intuitive Insight Podcast loves to get your feedback on any topics from previous episodes. We also want to give you an opportunity to have your mental health, counseling, wellness, and psychology questions answered, as well as a chance for you to share your story and discuss your thoughts. It's now time for our Intuitive Insight Mailbag. Okay, so our first question is actually something that I realized I did not go over in my initial episode, in episode 1. Someone asked me, how did you come up with the name Intuitive Insight? Well, to be very upfront and honest with all of you, intuitive insight was something that was a really difficult thing for me to come up with. But I was working with my former supervisor and my mentor, Lana Whitmarsh, and I was working with her through her agency at the time, which was called Insight Counseling and Consulting. And she kind of discussed with me about how she came up with the idea of Insight Counseling and Consulting, the name, in that she found the Honda Insight and thought, oh, that's an interesting thing. So she got the name from the Honda Insight. Now, how did I go ahead and find that together? And I utilized that as an homage to her, to one of my mentors, Insight. And then I started thinking, what is it that I know that I've been told that I have in terms of how I work as a counselor, in terms of how my counseling style, so on and so forth. And then one of the clients I was working with at the time, just before I started launching Intuitive Insight, I was finishing out my supervised hours and everything. A client told me, you know what, Tim? All of what you say and all of the questions you ask and all the things we explore, you are insanely intuitive. And I asked, hey, can you elaborate a little bit more on that? And this client explained to me that you just seem to have a sense of being able to put together all of these different things, like you're a detective of some sort. You're like Dr. Huang from Law and Order SVU. You can put together like these things that happened in my past, these things that are happening right now. It's insanely intuitive, and you can almost predict what's going to happen in the future. And I said, no, I can't predict what's happening in the future, but I very much appreciate the compliment. And once again, I thought right away, intuitive insight. Intuitive. So you're intuitive and you're so insightful. And right there, Intuitive Insight. That's where the name Intuitive Insight comes from. So I very, very much want to thank that client who I was working with at the time for giving me the inspiration. And I want to thank my mentor, my supervisor, Lana Whitmarsh, for helping me and for helping me through all the times during my supervisory time. And that's how Intuitive Insight came about. The second question I received was, I'm going to read this out loud. You mentioned something about living and deciding mindfully in one of your former episodes. What is mindfulness that you're talking about? Well, once again, I have to base this on one of my mentors especially early on in my career. Mindfulness is a DBT skill, dialectical behavioral therapy skill. And DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, is something that was invented and created by Marsha Linehan. Mindfulness is one of these tools. And if you think about it, mindfulness is a lot like, it's a very, very Zen Buddhist type perspective in which you're trying to be focused not so much on the past, not so much on the future, but really kind of in the present moment. So it's very, very Buddhist in that way. Now, specifically with mindfulness, especially as a DBT skill, one of the things to keep in mind is that we have to be mindful of our emotions. We have to be mindful of our logic, of our rationalizations. Sometimes what happens is when we experience emotions, we react with a behavior. And sometimes we react without even thinking at times. So trying to be mindful is trying to combine understanding and being aware of our emotions, as well as trying to be insightful with our rational mind, with our logical sense, and trying to utilize all of this information together to make a decision that works best for us as we see fit. Basically, it's like trying to, it's like, it's not, it's kind of like, it's trying not to overthink, because overthinking leads to inaction, and trying not to react, because reacting based on emotion leads to, because having an emotional reaction oftentimes has no thinking. We just do things rather than thinking about doing them first. So if you're putting them together, it's about trying to be aware of our emotions, aware of our difficulties, aware of our issues, and combining it with our logic. What's the best thing that we can do here? What are all the different things that are in front of me right now? What can I do? What would likely come out with the best outcome? And oftentimes, by being able to focus that, and once again, not the past, not the future, just in the present moment. By being able to focus these things in the present moment, we minimize our chances of having something negative happen. We minimize having an emotional reaction become something that lasts longer than it should, and we also minimize inaction. So, in terms of mindfulness, that's what mindfulness is. That's a skill that we can utilize. Something that is definitely teachable. Everyone that understands has a sense of mindfulness. It's really more about practicing it. Just like anything else, it's a skill that needs to be practiced regularly. At the end of each episode, we try to sum everything that we've talked about into small bits of insight that tries to inspire others and ourselves to build upon our own awareness and insight, as well as to help us in our journey of living a balanced life. It's time for the Insight of the Night. This episode focused on anxiety and the different types of anxiety. Earlier on, I mentioned that not all anxiety is bad. In fact, there's a good type of anxiety. If you want to liken it, I likened it to an anticipatory nervous type of anxiety. Like you're really, really, really excited for something to happen, and you can't wait. You're on the edge of your seat, and you want to be part of it now. Some examples: if you're riding a roller coaster and you enjoy roller coasters, that's something. If you're watching a football game, you're at a football game or a sporting event, that's another thing. This anxiety is always a positive one that you want to be part of. For some individuals had mentioned to me as an example just before before they're getting married, and they have that. They're hearing the music play, and they're standing at the altar, and they're waiting for their partner to come through the door. All of that kind of stuff. That's, once again, anticipatory anxiety, a good type of anxiety that makes us be on our toes, and makes us try and tries to make us tries to provide a good sense for us, something that we want to be part of. And then we have the negative type of anxiety. The one that I mentioned was based on a lot of fear. And once again, fear meaning fear of environment, fear of situation, fear of meeting expectations, fear of other people, fear of just fear. Ultimately, a lot of the root cause of anxiety is fear. And it can lead to us not wanting to live our lives, or being scared about doing something. And that's perfectly understandable. It's perfectly understandable if we're scared and we don't want to do something. And once again, this type of negative anxiety is more of the flight or freeze perspective of our fight or flight response. Yet at the same time, for as negative as there can be, as negative as anxiety can be, it's also something that we can overcome. And we can overcome this based on a number of different things, based on trying to challenge ourselves, trying to find someone who's gone through a similar situation in the past, trying to reach out for help, whether through therapy, whether through seeking out a doctor who can prescribe us medications to help us with it, lifestyle changes, confronting our own fears, confronting our own demons, confronting our own issues, trying to better understand ourselves and why we are experiencing so much fear as the root, and trying to establish what this root cause is, what this root fear is that makes us anxious. There's tons of different things that we can do. And of course, there are always techniques that we can utilize. For example, for social phobias, for regular phobias, you have graduated exposure techniques. It's like, for example, if you're fearful of bugs, there are ways to eventually get used to, eventually be okay and stabilize your anxiety, even if you're in the presence of a bug. Same thing with heights or tight spaces like claustrophobia and everything like that. There are different ways that you can do that. Behavioral ways, cognitive behavioral ways, so many different ways. But ultimately, anxiety is based on fear. It's based on our fight or flight response. Negative anxiety is based on fear, and the positive anxiety is based on excitement. It can be based on excitement. Once again, we have other types of anxiety as well. For example, you have different motivations for anxiety. You have a student who wants to make sure that they pass an exam. Maybe they don't want to take this exam, or they don't want to take this exam or do it, but at the same time, they know it's something they have to do, and they overcome this anxiety by trying to prepare, by trying to study, by trying to be as prepared as we can for any given moment, and then we go ahead and take it. A lot of the things at the end of the day with anxiety, something I've always noticed, especially when working with many different people with anxiety over the years, is that anxiety tends to be something, the anticipation for something is worse than the actual activity of it. So many times you might just think to yourself, oh man, I'm so worried. I am so worried about what's going to happen. But then when you're actually doing the activity, it's no big deal. It's like the anxiety melts away. And why is that? It's because we're actually participating. A lot of the fear that we might be experiencing is just our expectation. Oh my, the worst case scenario is going to happen. But really, once we get into it, sometimes it's not as bad as we think. And that, I think, is a very important aspect of trying to manage and get a handle of our anxiety. Remember that if it works out, if we try it and it does not, and it does not work out to the best of our expectations, that's understandable. But at least we gave it a chance. We gave it an opportunity. And most of the time, I can't say all the time, but most of the time, when we face our anxieties, we realize that the actual thing, doing the thing that makes us feel anxious, when we're actually doing it, it's not so bad. And that's another way we can overcome our anxiety. We also introduced the Intuitive Insight Mailbag for all of you who want to ask questions and share stories about mental health issues, counseling, psychiatry, psychology, living a well-balanced lifestyle, you name it. Send me any questions or any stories that you like to share via email at media@intuitiveinsightcounseling.com, and hopefully your information, your story, your question will be featured on a future Intuitive Insight podcast episode. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or stories regarding your mental health, balance, or counseling journey, which you'd like to share on a future Intuitive Insight Mailbag, please send them to media@intuitiveinsightcounseling.com. That's all for this episode of the Intuitive Insight Podcast. I hope that there was something that helped bring a little bit of insight into your life. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to take the journey with us to build your insight, subscribe to the Intuitive Insight Podcast. Check out intuitiveinsightmedia.com for updates for our next episode. As always, this is Timmy E. of the Intuitive Insight Podcast, and don't forget, strong on our own, more powerful together. Have a great night.